Okay, so welcome everyone, and a quick note that we are recording and that the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Wabagul people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. I'd also like to thank Cultural Collections for hosting us today. It's great to be back here, and we're secretly hoping this is the first of many such occasions. Our presenter today, our own Nancy Cushing, is an environmental historian here at the University of Newcastle and an expert in human-animal relations. And she is also, may I add, a most excellent colleague.
Yes.
She currently... passed with acclaim from the room. She currently holds the Coral Thomas Fellowship at the State Library of New South Wales, where she's been working on a research project highlighting some of the animals that have helped to make Sydney's history and how they have enriched human lives. In doing so, she seeks to bolster efforts to sustain multi-species living in urban places as we face an increasingly uncertain future together. Her paper today, being held by popular demand, I add, is a repeat of her Coral Thomas lecture reporting on that project. Nancy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and thanks everybody. It is lovely to be back in this room. I think the last talk I gave here was in 2020, very early, and I was talking about air pollution. And I was saying that people that had fought the fires and been exposed to so much bushfire smoke might be badly affected by the impending pandemic that we have no sense of the scale of. And I think things shut down pretty quickly after that talk, which was completely unrelated. So thank you so much, Sasha, for the introduction and the acknowledgement of country. And I could just also further extend my own respect to elders of this land, but also to the Eora people who are the traditional owners of the land that I'm talking about today. So I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity to say a few words about the University of Newcastle, which is currently celebrating its 60th anniversary since it gained autonomy from the University of New South Wales. There's been a lot of branding around this, email footers and banners flying and special events for special people, but little grassroots commemoration or reflection, and certainly not the chance to reenact student leader Mike Nelson and classic legend Godfrey Tanner's celebratory bonfire that they held on New Year's Eve, I believe, on the site where the Great Hall was later built. And I can see Johnny is nodding and perhaps wanted to reenact that bonfire. So that's a shame. But while the university has been around for 60 years, that is not the case for many of its programs and disciplines, some of which have disappeared and didn't make it to 60 years, and others that have been added during that time. History is one of the foundational HAS disciplines that has endured, and you can see the list there of what was in the Bachelor of Arts in 1965, much more diverse than the current Bachelor of Arts. But we have some survivors: sociology, English, French, and at least up to this anniversary year, German. Drama, philosophy, and Australian studies are still represented, although not as fully fledged disciplines. Only Italian has actually been fully lost. And I don't know why ancient history and classics aren't here, because Godfrey Tanner was the one who was involved with the bonfire. So clearly classics is being taught, but it's not on this list. My point is that history at Newcastle is closer to 70, maybe 71, than 60, because it was first taught at the University of Newcastle College through the University of New England from 1954 at what is now the Tighes Hill TAFE campus. When the historians moved to Callaghan at about this time, late in 1965, it was still a construction site, with the McMullen building one of the few that was ready for occupation by the faculties of Arts, Economics and Commerce, the library, and university administration. So the McMullen building was, a microcosm of the university at that time. And you can see the people who are listed as being in our School of History. And I looked at these names and I thought, really? Was P.J. O'Farrell here as a senior lecturer in 1965? Was Brian Fletcher here with Bede Nairn here. That's really cool. And then the name at the bottom, Coral Lansbury, Malcolm Turnbull's mom, but also, of course, a scholar in her own right. That's really quite odd. I didn't know these people were here. And so I thought I better actually not take documentary evidence as read, but be a critical historian and contact someone who was one of the first honours graduates, Chris Canine, who I've worked with through the ADB. And so he was an honours grad on the first list in March of 1965 in history. And I said, Chris, did you study with these people at Newcastle? Were they here on the ground? He said, no, I studied with Greg Cranfield, Jeff Cranfield, Greg McMinn, and Lionel Fredman were the people that he'd worked with. These were the people at the University of New South Wales. They never came to Newcastle as far as we know. So the handbook is it's a little bit of a, not representing the University of Newcastle per se. And I must look at the next year. This is the Faculty of Arts handbook for 1965. Must check 1966 and see if they've started to actually admit to who was teaching here at that time. So I was going to say that these people were pestered by mosquitoes as they went out onto the campus, but not them, but other people were. And so the cute things that are in this looking back history that was written by John Wright at an earlier anniversary, talked about how as they set up shop at Callaghan, staff complained about a sea of mud as they moved between the different buildings, vicious attacks from mosquitoes, especially as they waited to buy a sandwich at lunchtime from a pie cart or an outdoor kiosk known as the Shack. And I thought, plus ça change. I mean, it's, except for the mud, not so different all these years later. But I was also interested that Chris mentioned Lionel Fredman, because there's a connection. When I started here, Lionel Fredman was still teaching here for about 4 years, I think, in American history. Okay, now my next diversion from my own talk is to promote Effie's, which is happening next week. So Effie is going to be talking about Janet Merv Copley as Newcastle's quiet activist in the 50s and 60s on the 18th at 10:30, right in this room. And then there'll be a tour of the exhibition Say Ah, which is downstairs, and that's where we'll be going for morning tea today as well. So immediately after this. Okay, no further ado. I first delivered this lecture in the beautiful new auditorium beneath the New South Wales State Library on the 22nd of October this year. It was the culmination of my 2-year Coral Thomas Fellowship with that institution. Oh, it's twice now. This is a picture of Coral Thomas. It's really been a pleasure to have had a home there, so well supported by the librarians led by Rachel Franks, and generously made possible by donor Rob Thomas, and having other Newcastle colleagues around me as well, including Effie and Kathy Colburn, and next year Alistair Rolls and Janine Baker have fellowships there. My 2 years are up. I just wanted to show you the space that I've been enjoying. My 2 years are up at the end of this year when I make way for incoming Coral Thomas Fellow Dr. Mark Dunn, who, being from Singleton and having written the Convict Valley, can be counted as an honorary Lancastrian as well. I will continue to be a fixture as an honorary fellow next year and resume the still enviable status of ordinary reader and library friend after that. And I did want to share this picture of the Donald Horn Room, which is where the fellows have the privilege of working and networking and, chatting and commiserating while at the State Library, because this is the vision that I really had for Lyndall Ryan's library coming to this institution. And I don't know that anything like that will happen, but I thought it would be lovely to have a little separate space with her collection and some room where people could work and commune and talk and have important conversations.
Send us a responsibility.
Okay, will do. Is there a suggestion box somewhere? I'll pop it in. But I think that would be a really lovely tribute and something that we need. And maybe we can make it a lab, and then the university will understand what we're talking about. Okay, so it really has been a tremendous 2 years. And during that time, I've taken my research far and wide. In the first year, 2024, I gave a dozen public talks at universities, a regional library, historical societies, and city clubs. I traveled to the World Congress of Environmental Historians in Oulu, Finland, and told them about Australia's rabbits while learning about urban animals on other continents. I gave a public talk at the State Library about the history of the ibis in Sydney, a bird with whom I've become particularly fond, and with whom I now seem to be connected. And I do get emails from members of the general public saying, an ibis stole my sandwich at lunchtime. What would you suggest that I do? I'm a historian. I don't know. This year, I've continued to carry the Coral Thomas torch, with highlights being a keynote address at the International Australian Studies Association conference at Macquarie University on Sydney's whales, an article about whether pets really like being pets in the conversation, which has attracted about 100,000 readers globally, several media interviews, and a chapter on possums for an Oxford handbook on global animals. So underpinning all of this outside activity was time spent in the library, 2 days of most weeks. When I applied for the fellowship, I was honest. I didn't have a key set of papers of which I would read every word and come up with a new definitive understanding of a person, event, or industry. My project on the animals of Sydney was much more diffuse, and there were good reasons for that. That is, and here I can't help but apply suitable metaphors, I would be wading into the vast holdings of the library on a fishing expedition. Or, as I wrote on my recent open book piece, I would be on an archival safari hunting the animals of Sydney, although not to subdue or possess them, but to make their lives more visible. I came to this topic after several decades of studying how both Indigenous and settler Australians have related to other animals. Work on kangaroos, funnel webs, snakes, and pigs made it clear that settlers tend to play down the role's significance and subjectivity of other than human life, viewing them primarily as adjuncts to our more important lives. But that doesn't mean that we don't genuinely care about them and crave their presence. There is ample evidence of human affection for animals and our desire to surround ourselves with representations of them. Next time you're in the Mitchell reading room, lift your gaze to the stained glass windows just below the ceiling. On the eastern wall, you'll notice 3 stained glass windows. They were designed in the 1940s, and they depict scenes from Chaucer's Canterbury tales. Even from the ground level, and maybe even from this audience, you can just make out that there are horses as the key central figure in 2 of the windows. I was lucky enough to be escorted up those stairs. You know how you sit in the library and you think, I'd love to go up there and just look at those books. I was lucky enough as a fellow to have that privilege to be escorted up the stairs and to have a much closer look at these windows. And there I could see that the designer, Arthur G. Benfield, had included other animals, both mythical and actual, around the borders of the windows as well. One is a furry-eared koala. Not otherwise associated with 14th century England, but obviously considered important enough to include here. Elsewhere, there are 3 ibises, a bird that was then a rare visitor to Sydney in the 1940s, but was highly esteemed because of a mistaken assumption that they were the same as the sacred ibises of Egypt, and I suspect that's what's really being portrayed here. But also an accurate one in that they were allies of farmers with a healthy appetite for grasshoppers. So they really were quite popular in Australia at that time in the 1940s. Moving outside, we have the 1925 statue of Matthew Flinders, who was given a furry companion in his deer cat Trim, sculpted by Kiama artist John Cornwell in 1996. So you just see Trim down here accompanying Flinders. There are several other statues of Flinders around the world, and Trim is in all of them, to my knowledge. The statue of Governor Burke, moved into its place in front of the library in 1927, has no permanent animal counterpart, but does enjoy a revolving array of bird attendants, encouraged to flock there by treats scattered for them or conveniently left in open rubbish bins. And when I went out to take a picture, I was so pleased that this pigeon decided to look at me quite quizzically as I was doing it. So for me, as an animal historian writing about Sydney's urban history, these windows and statues are evidence of a wider human desire to have other animals with us, whether on journeys, in our homes, in our art, while we still cast ourselves in the starring roles. So my Coral Thomas project tries to challenge that habit of overlooking animals by bringing them out of the background and exploring ways in which humans and other animals have acknowledged one another's presence in Sydney. And I guess, as Sasha was saying in the introduction, it's not pure research undertaken only for the sake of understanding the past, as important as I think that kind of history is. The contribution I hope to make is showing how multi-species living has been managed in urban places as encouragement for continuing to do so as we face an increasingly uncertain future together. And so I'll come back to this at the end. Now, for this Newcastle version of the talk, I feel I need to pause here and apologize for making the focus of this study Sydney. It doesn't have to be Sydney, of course. What I'm talking about holds true of other cities as well. As a long-time historian of and advocate for Newcastle, it seems rather treacherous to have abandoned it for another city, but I have succumbed to the allure of the larger centre, as so many do, with its better documented past, its richer array of natural and built environments, its wider audience of people interested in hearing and reading about it. So it's not you, Newcastle, it's me, and I will be back. My next project starts right here on our own Bushland campus. And I wanted to wear this. This is my fellow's lanyard that I've worn through the 2 years with Newcastle printed on it, so nobody could mistake where I was from. Okay, so for now, to Sydney. The past I am considering starts in 1788, that heavily loaded year of invasion and dispossession. The uninvited and unwelcome arrival of 1,500 British people and assorted exotic species of animals at Warrain, Sydney Cove in January of that year is the starting point of urban living on this continent. They brought an idea of the city as a place in which humans were privileged and other animals only welcome on limited terms. This was, of course, a dramatic contrast with how humans and other animals had lived together in Australia up to that time. In Aboriginal cosmologies, other animals are loved and respected kin with shared deep time histories. They're not separate from or lower than humans, but equal members in what is known in English as country. These older views were not supplanted, but had to coexist with the newer ones in the growing area that could be considered urban Sydney. As Vanessa Berry reminded readers in Mirror Sydney, Sydney is a recent invention. And it is that invented place that I am exploring. So despite the idea of cities being for people, other animals were much more numerously present, although you will look for them in vain on maps like this one. And here I would just, this is very early on, April 1788, and I'd just like you to take note of what is actually centred in this, which is a stream of water running into Sydney Cove called Tank Stream. So we'll come back to that too. Sydney was built on and relied upon a rich, more than human ecosystem. Some animals were pushed out or killed. New animals arrived, including riding horses, dairy cows, garbage-consuming pigs, goats, poultry, and companion animals from dogs to birds. Uninvited guests turned up as well, rats, mice, insects, and other commensal animals who joined the legions of free-living animals already present and not intending to go anywhere, the worms, the flies, the fleas, spiders, moths, frogs, fish, birds, and water rats. So from the start, the city was, like others, a hybrid network in which human and other animals both had key roles. Urban historians have taken notice of some of these animals, but mainly in ways that understood them as a problem. They have documented how animals have been employed in cities as beasts of burden or sources of milk, meat, and eggs, and urban hazards that this created, from bad smells to water pollution to disease. They then explored the measures taken to address these problems, which generally resulted first in improved sanitation and later sequestering of animal-based industries on the urban margins. A prime example of this is the movement over time of the slaughtering of pigs, cattle, and sheep for meat from dispersed butchers' premises to the centralized Glebe Island abattoir in the 1830s, and then in 1915 to a massive facility at Homebush to which rural livestock could be delivered by train. So while I acknowledge this sort of darker side of animals in cities, I'm trying to turn things around to focus more on positive relations between humans and other animals. We've all felt them, hearing the call of a bird, seeing a silent fruit bat passing overhead, viewing a whale from a headland, cuddling our companion animals. Having other animals with us in cities brings opportunities for experiences of awe, connection, admiration, gratitude, affection, amusement, and companionship. Animals have also provided motive power, employment, and ecosystem services. The human experience of living in cities would be greatly diminished without them. Whether these relations are as positive for other animals is a different question. At best, I think I can say that there are some benefits to animals of life in cities, even if they are uncertain, shifting, and unequal. My search is for evidence of animal agency and autonomy in Sydney and the traces they left in the city, both practical and symbolic. So let's go to some of these stories. Those of you who've been following along with me through the fellowship will already have heard me talk about whale watching in the later 19th century, which I did again in Mossman a couple of nights ago. The famous white cats who helped draw people to visit Sydney Harbour Bridge in the 1950s and 60s, and the rise of the ibis. Today, I'm going to talk about three new examples of how the presence of other animals has been acknowledged, respected, and accommodated for. Birds as companions in the early colonial period, animals in representations of the built environment in the 20th century, and in our own time, the forgotten songs art installation in Angel Place. As I put my work together into a book on this topic, these chapters will be structured chronologically around specific types of relations like I'm talking about today. So in the first decades of Sydney as a city, it was a crowded, more than human space, with the original inhabitants, both human and non-human, doing their best to get on with their lives, while the invaders, both human and non-human, set up their lives in the same location. Much has been written about the methods and devastating effects of colonization, but here I want to focus on the loneliness of the early arrivals. There is talk now about Sydney becoming a city without grandchildren. But at this time, most of its settler residents had no blood relations present at all, unless they bore their own children. Other relationships were new, shallow, and often hostile. Few of the convicts of this period left records of their emotional experience of exile, although love tokens that they left behind them demonstrated their anticipation of the pain of separation. In the 1795, one exception was a small group of political prisoners transported from Scotland. In a 1795 petition seeking to be allowed to leave New South Wales, they wrote that Scotland was entwisted in every fibre of our hearts. At the heart of penal colonization, then, was an ache, an emptiness that needed to be filled. And one way of making up for the absence of kin was through interspecies relationships. For officers, this could be with the dogs that they alone were permitted to bring on the voyage. Their greyhounds and wolfhounds became the foundational stock of the Australian kangaroo dog, recently the subject of an award-winning ABC podcast by Jane Curtis. Chaplain Richard Johnson was one of the people in an exceptionally privileged position because he was able to bring both cats and his wife, Mary. So he did have close relations. Experiments were made with keeping native species, but the only type to really take hold were the birds. The region's colourful parrots were considered particularly suitable as companion animals. Whereas many of the native mammals were nocturnal and cautious around humans, birds made their presence felt with their bright colours, rapid movement, and loud calls. And so if you look at the accounts, the first fleet journals and so on, people are always talking about the beautiful birds that they've seen, the exotic, lovely birds. Someone who I think wrote about this really well is a little bit later, but Louise Meredith, writing in the 1840s, captured her emotional response in seeing Sydney's colourful parrots. She described their noisy flocks as screaming parties, all as gay and happy as splendid colours and glad freedom could make them. To her, they were like living gems and gold, so vividly they shone in the sun. And the curiosity was mutual, and I think that's an important part of it. The birds are also looking back. Meredith noted that parrots did not just return the human gaze, but were inspecting us, first with one eye and then with the other, and we probably all had that feeling too. As Tim Lowe explored in Where Song Began, Australia's birds are on average much more aggressive than those of other continents, emboldened by the need to defend access to abundant nectar produced by eugenids in particular. And so that we're not making it up with the magpies. They are seriously world-class aggressive birds. So in addition to their beauty and activity, a key point of interest were the sounds that birds made. And there was some disappointment here, it must be said. Surgeon Arthur Bowes-Smythe wrote, there was an infinity of small birds, including some with very handsome plumage, but none were singing ones. And later, Judge Benfield described the sounds of some birds as harsh and vulgar, like those of the parrot kind, the cockatoo, the coachman's whip bird, the bellbird, which I call the creaking wheel bird, he wrote, the razor grinder, we're really getting a depression, and the laughing jackass, the kookaburra. But a sort of cuckoo-noted bird sings at night, something between the voice of an English cuckoo and the bark of a watchdog. Nice, and I think that's the koala that people still complain about hearing at night. At a time before any form of recorded music or broadcasting, even the chirps, squawks, and whistles of Australian birds brought acoustic liveliness into otherwise silent tents, huts, and houses. There was a particular interest in birds who could be persuaded to make noises resembling human speech. When a bird of a new species was taken at Kissing Point in 1803, the details communicated in the newspaper were its size, its coloration, and whether it could talk. Then unknown. The next year, a man named Addy, who had taken great pains to teach a mountain parrot to speak with ease and familiarity, claimed that when seized by a bird of prey, it cried out, "Oh, the hawk! Zounds, the hawk!" So he was very proud of himself that he'd created this voice for the bird. Addy was relieved to be able to rescue his protege. The ability to trap free-living animals made keeping them accessible, even to those with limited means. One Sydney family in 1803 shared their humble home with 4 dogs, 3 cats, 5 parrots, and a kangaroo. Settlers could not leave the relationship at appreciation, of course, but extended it to holding birds in captivity so they could enjoy their company all the time and turn them into a commodity. Not all birds were accepting of this, and the use of wooden cages provided opportunities for escape. So I've got a note here, much later, not in Sydney, but illustrative. So you can see the bird cages on the front of this bark hut in Hill End, just as an impression of the birds in cages. If trust had been established, the relationship could continue even after the birds had broken out of these wooden cages. As in a case in 1805, when captive parrots who had been taught to speak chewed through the wooden bars of their cage. Their trainer recounted how they continued to pay him visits for food, and that one day, when miles away from home, one of them, a very handsome mountaineer parrot, spotted him and called out, "Be quick, be quick." Methods of incarceration were stepped up. Brass wire bird cages and iron wire for making them being imported by the late 1810s to make escape more difficult. People didn't let their birds go easily. In 1814, Anne Grant of Castlereagh Street reported the theft of 2 birds that had come originally from New Zealand and their cage. The birds' tails had been cut short, presumably to hinder their capacity to escape unaided. In 1820, Surgeon John Harris offered the large reward of £5 sterling for information about a Derwent or Tasmanian magpie lost as it was moved between Sydney Hospital and his home in Parramatta. At least part of its value was in its inimitable mockery of a puppy dog in distress. Birds could be sold for a better price if they could talk. In 1805, a very handsome parrot was advertised for sale from Pitt's Row, with its principal point of attraction being the vocal powers that were uncommonly extensive and being able to deliver 4 distinct tunes. Birds were not, of course, willing participants in this trade. In 1803, 5 parrots were sold in Sydney at 18 pence a head. The purchaser was more than disappointed when they quickly abandoned him. Nor did parents accept separation from their chicks. In 1814, the parents of young birds found in a nest near Lane Cove fed them through the bars of a homemade cage that they had been incarcerated in. So these examples of the birds of the early colonial period show how Sydney's birds brought colour, movement, sound, and companionship into the lives of settlers. It also shows that even in cases in which the interspecies relationship was based on admiration from the point of view of humans, there were unequal costs borne by the animals in terms of loss of freedom and often shortened lives. Adaptable birds did find some benefits in these relationships, or when they could, brought them to an end by flying away. In comparison with other types of animals, birds have generally proven to be remarkably resilient in the face of the changes colonization has brought, and have retained a high profile throughout its history. Time check. Okay. Another aspect of Sydney's animal history that I'm very interested in is how animals have been embedded in the built environment, as I've already discussed for the State Library building. This occurs both physically in spaces shaped with the needs of animals in mind, in structures like stables and horse troughs, like this one, that cater for their needs, and linguistically in animal names applied to urban localities because of some association with them. So think of Haymarket or Goat Island or cow pastures. So while I delight in walking and carefully looking as research methods and do lots of both, I'm equally interested in how animals are embedded in representations of the city. And so here I'm going to move on to the 20th century and trace the shift from the most visible animals in Sydney being working horses to those accorded the greatest attention being associated with leisure and enjoyment. This can be seen in many maps and plans made to reflect the changing city. On the insurance maps that detail each building in the central city area, the very direct displacement of horse-related businesses and spaces can be seen in the first decades of the 20th century, as stables become car parks and service stations, and livery yards become automobile showrooms. So here is an example. This is the most animal block in Sydney, as far as I can tell. So it's Darling Harbour, where Paddy's Market is now. So the Sydney Municipal Council markets with a poultry market at one end were built between 1909 and 1912. They had spaces for 310 horse-drawn carts. That's what you can see here, where people could bring in their produce and sell it. It's now Market City with the Paddy's Market inside it. This is the same building from 1909. And circled, I have Walter Puxley's bird shop on Key Street, where animals were sold as pets and was later moved to the Queen Victoria markets. And so this block is really full of animal-related businesses. And the yellow near the top is a livestock place. You can see the poultry market right at the top. But then also on the upper level of those buildings is parking for motor vehicles. So that's the shift that we're seeing at this time. In this block, which is the Anthony Horden block bounded by Liverpool, Pitt, Campbell and George Streets opposite the Capitol Theatre, I have encircled the city sale yards where animals were being sold, a business called the Anglo-American Popcorn Company, which is right next door to the Sydney Homing Pigeon Society, which I thought was a lovely juxtaposition. How do you get your birds to come back? Well, we're right beside the Anglo-American Popcorn Company. And then behind them, a garage and motor works. And the one on the left is Ingles Bird Shop. So again, we're seeing the just little traces of animals through the city, but often the sale yards, the stables, and so on are being replaced over time by facilities for motor vehicles. And then here's another one. This is the People's Palace block at Pitt, Campbell, Castlereagh, and Goulburn. And the main roads building is this one. And you know, I love to see these sort of maps in process. And so you can see that there's been sticky tape applied and they've changed what the use was. And so what we can see on here are Chinese shops at the front and a yard with stables at the back. And then in the next iteration, the main roads board has occupied that entire block. So the insurance maps are serious business, and they're put together with scrupulous attention to matters of life, death, and potentially large payouts. So now I turn to more frivolous depictions of the city. I hope I am. Yes. So this is the maps printed on the back of the menus at Carl's chain of restaurants, which some of you, if you've been around Sydney for a while, might remember. Don is nodding. Yay, I thought Don would be someone who would been to one or two of these restaurants. So the first is dated to 1939, when they had 3 premises. You can see they're marking themselves with a sort of a banner there in the middle of the city. The chosen locations near the theatre and retail centre of Sydney on Castlereagh, Martinplace, and Pitt Streets. And they were advertised as places of retreat from the hot work of shopping, because they were the only air-conditioned restaurants in Australia at the time, so they said. In keeping with this appeal to pleasure and ease, their map showcases not only city streets and landmarks, including the still novel bridge, which had only been open for 7 years at this time, but many leisure activities based around non-human animals. So I'm sure you've all been looking for them while I've had it up. Sure. So let's see, how many animals can we find here? Some of them relate to place names, so that's Goat Island, Crow's Nest, Randed Seagull, the animals at Toronto Zoo, a snail in the Botanic Gardens for reasons unknown. Now I don't know this one. Kiyama, and they seem to be playing polo, but okay, must have been a thing then. A museum with some of the skeletal animals in it, Randwick and the horses, and a cow at the Royal Show. So animals were very important in their sort of geography of leisure at this time in Sydney. 40 years later, Carl's, they kept updating their maps, and I love the graphic art, how it's changed. The colours are so much more vibrant in the 1970s. Many of the featured aspects of the city remain, and some new ones appear, like the Opera House, opened in 1973. The animals remain visually present, and their range is expanded. A new feature is an icon for each of the chain's many themed wine bars. So there's a Vienna wood swan, an African lion for the South African wine bar. A Chinese lion marks the Asian trader Lotus Blossom wine bar in Chatswood. And a kangaroo shows the Coolabah Tree Squatters wine bar in North Sydney with its dinkum Australian atmosphere and specialty dish, Swagman's Rabbit Hot Pot. So let's repeat the exercise and see. We've got Cockatoo Island. This is one, that's the Chatswood one. That is Gore Hills, so the television, Cowboys and Indians. More of the restaurants, different representation of the zoo, Manly Aquarium, restaurants, again, a different representation of the museum, Randwick, I think that's the showground again, and then just a shark at large in the harbour. So the animals are a very strong presence in these representations. And so this is all very much in keeping with the thesis developed by John Berger in his 1977 essay, Wide Look at Animals. He argues, based on his own observations of this time, the 1970s, that as animals were displaced from people's lives by changing technologies, sanitation concerns, and high-density living, city dwellers found new ways to meet their deeply felt need to engage with animals, even if only watching them from a distance or engaging with representations of them like those on this map. So bringing birds and representations together in our current century and expanding on this idea of engaging with animals even when they are absent is my final example of animals in Sydney, the Forgotten Songs installation, hung in the airspace above Angel Place in 2012. Angel Place is a narrow lane that runs from George to Pitt Streets, parallel to Martin Place. It crosses the course of the Tank Stream that I drew your attention to earlier, the waterway that nurtured the plants and animals of Lorraine and drew the attention of Governor Phillip to what he called Sydney Cove. So I think I don't know if that was intended, but I think it's really lovely that there is that cross, that intersection with the Tank Stream. Forgotten Songs is a work by Michael Thomas Hill in collaboration with Australian Museum ornithologist Dr. Richard Major and wildlife sound recordist Fred Van Gessel. It consists of an aerial thicket of empty bird cages and a soundtrack of the calls of 50 species of birds native to this part of the city, where the Tank Stream once burgeoned. The calls echo eerily between the buildings, alternating between those of the day, things like the eastern whipbird, the rock warbler, regent honeyeater, and many others, and the night, including the owlet nightjar, the powerful owl, and the recently crowned bird of the year, the tawny frogmouth. Hill intended the artwork to be beautiful and unexpected, and to prompt reflection on both the city's underlying landscape and the losses that occurred with urban development. And while the whole thing is very impressive, I think the inscribing of the names of the birds on the pavers on the ground is very evocative, because it really reminds you of the memorial stones lining the floors of British cathedrals with remains lying underneath them. In the material posted online about the installation by the City of Sydney, I did find it odd, though, that there is actually nothing said about the bird cages. I'm not even clear if there are 180 or 200 of them, as sources differ, or whether they were collected or constructed specifically for the exhibition. And it was put up as a temporary exhibition and then rehung as an ongoing one. And I think maybe some of these anomalies are because of that things are really different between the two. But it does also leave room for speculation, and don't historians love that? So are they meant to suggest that the changes made to Sydney mean birds can only survive in captivity? Is that like the cages have become the birds? That's not true. There's lots of birds around Sydney. That we only welcome animals we choose and can contain and control. That we're so divorced from the natural world that we don't see it for itself, but only through meta-nymphs like the cages we made for it. That's really sad. That's what it's saying. But I offer a positive interpretation that follows something else the artist said. He wanted to explore how Sydney's fauna has evolved and adapted to coexist with increased urbanization. Taking this view, the cages, although not the environments that birds enjoyed prior to Sydney's establishment, might stand in for the new types of hybrid spaces like parks and backyards and telephone poles and high-rises, where birds do continue to live and even thrive, including some that had no place here before the changes brought by urbanization. In this spirit, the shelter offered by the bird cages can be understood as one of the gestures of hospitality, which I would argue we need to become better at making. When I visited the installation again this week, I wondered if this pigeon, a non-native species, felt that he was being sufficiently welcomed in that space. Maybe he goes around the bird cages and says, "Let me in," because I don't think they have any open doors. That would be another really interesting project. So, time to wrap up. It's time to address the historian's most important question, so what? It's lovely to track down stories of care and admiration and companionship and accommodation, but why does it matter? It matters because 1788 can not only be seen as a pivotal year because of the launch of the invasion of Australia, but also as an important time in world history, as the Industrial Revolution was gaining momentum in Great Britain with their innovations in burning coal to generate steam for transport and production. As we see in the news each day, this has led to a dramatically different world in just 2.5 centuries of what some call the Anthropocene. That awkward term means a period in which humans are shaping the planet in intended and unintended ways, on a scale that in the past has only been achieved by huge volcanic eruptions and meteor strikes. Cities are part of these transformations, with 68% of the world's population projected to be living in urban areas by 2050, according to UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs projections. The more people there are in cities, the more cities sprawl over lands and waters that have supported populations of other animals, and the more resources from other areas are drawn into those cities. Where once it was only the immediate hinterlands of cities that were drained of food, water, stone, sand, and other goods to support the people living in them, these shadow lands can now exist oceans away from the cities they support. And so one outcome of this shifting of resources is that animals long thought to have been banished from urban areas are reappearing in them or even establishing populations in them for the first time. In Sydney, returnees include brush turkeys and wallabies. Those newly colonizing the city include deer and ibis, and some established residents are escaping human custody to resume autonomous lives. Short breakouts in recent years have included baboons, cattle, and horses in Sydney streets and railway stations. And some of them established longer-term presence as well. And so here's one that has recolonized or colonized Sydney very effectively in the past few years. I won't take the time to work through that little case study, but I'm sure you're all aware. So, although seeing urban animals can initially trigger delight and is often reported in a humorous way because they're seen as out of place, an extended presence often becomes fraught as amusement turns to annoyance and concern over interference with the human ways of doing things with little room for empathy. My aim is that my history of living with animals in Sydney will assist with the navigation of this new era in which habitat loss and climate change make cities the most habitable places, drawing in human as well as non-human refugees. A new urban history that brings animals out of the background can provide the examples we need to inform and inspire ways of living that give all species their best chances of future thriving. Thank you.
Thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. Can I open the floor to questions?
Thank you, Nancy, and it's terrific to hear such things being talked about. Just picking up on some of the last things you were talking about, the cages are empty, so do we have to think about that? You mentioned about the doors being shut, but I mean, there's no attempt to depict a caged bird. But associated with that exhibition maybe tells us something else, and that's we're willing to put in a soundscape of bird sound during the day and during the night, different ones. But how do local birds react to something like that? Because, I mean, we disrupt their environments through light and sound all the time. So, I mean, does an exhibition like that have to go through any checks that it's not creating problems?
Yes, I don't know what sort of an ethical process they would have had to do. They did have involvement from the Australian Museum, so they would be accustomed to operate within ethical bounds. But it seemed to me that the assumption they started from was that the city is an absolute wasteland, that there is no animal life left in the city proper. And, you know, in a back alley like Angel Place, yeah, you tend to agree. Yeah. You would hardly ever see a fly, but there are pigeons, you know, there's sort of, there'll be rats there of an evening, I'm sure, because it's also.
It's lovely for us. I was just wondering about for them.
Yeah. Well, that pigeon that I saw was certainly the first bird that I'd seen in that area. But yeah, you're quite right that the calls that they've recorded, who even knows what those calls were communicating? So were they distress calls? Are they, is this now sort of this place? Don't go anywhere near Angel Place. This is a scary place. Could well be. Yeah, we just don't know enough and we don't pay enough attention. Yeah, so thank you.
And Nancy, so wonderful. I really, really enjoyed that. And I think you've got such innovative ways of casting the narrative and thinking about periodisation. So really excellent. I've got a question about the regulation of animals and thinking about that legal history kind of approach. Do people have to have licences in 19th or 20th century Sydney to have certain types of animals like chickens in their backyards? What's the story there?
Yeah, so that really began to be regulated under Board of Health sort of regulations by the late 19th century. And the general thrust, the movement was to get them out. And so they become more and more constrained. They were very common to have goats in the street, for example, certainly poultry in the backyard, pigs. I mean, pigs were one of the first to be regulated, and that did so very early on because of the damage that they did and can do. You may know the book called Pig Bites Baby, and that was based on a real story from the Sydney Gazette. And there are very early legal cases about pigs in the city. Right. And then the other one that I've tracked in other work is about the movement that I mentioned about the cattle and slaughtering and how it was really diffuse and then became more concentrated. And so as it became more concentrated, they were moving live animals through the streets at night. And that's something, again, in most cities that becomes regulated by the 1840s, 1850s. That firstly, that you can only move at night because it's disruptive to have these unruly animals in the streets during the day. But then finally that you can't have them at night at all. And the acoustic elements of animals in the city is something that really intrigues me, and I've tried to do as much as I can as well.
Thank you. Thanks.
Nancy, just getting back to that first question that you were asked about the wildlife. I mean, I noticed at the university at a particular hour when the people had gone away, all the animals come out. They come out at a particular time when we vanish out of the scene. Now, in a city, I never hang around any parts of Sydney too long to experience that. But I'm sure that homeless people might know that. If you whoever lives on the street will probably see it because they're there all the time when all the crowds go. They would know what the wildlife is, if there is any, would be doing. But it just made me think that maybe they would know, because even here, I mean, once it just noticed that the possums all came out, it was like once the people had gone, out came the wildlife of the university to feed on everything that we rubbished during the course of the day. So it's
nice point. I hadn't thought of that, and it is like that they are there, present and witnessing what goes on all the time. That's the ethics of doing an oral history project with unhoused people in the streets of Sydney sort of are intimidating, but that's interesting.
Well, even historically, thinking of the vagrancy aspect, whether or not people, and I don't know if I found anything or not, I can have a look whether they had dogs with them, that kind of thing, people who lived on the street. That could be a useful past.
Yeah, that has been. I mean, there were a lot more animals, free living animals in the streets of cities like Sydney in the 19th century, of course, and there are wonderful accounts, people talking about the noise and the disruption and how they intervened and so on. Dogs and cats principally, but others, goats and pigs as well. And certainly Indigenous people living in Sydney were always accompanied by dogs, and that's been documented too. So there is a whole life that goes on out of doors, and really when I was I won't try to get back to it, but the insurance maps have they document every building and every structure, but therefore they also document the space that isn't occupied by a structure. And that's really interesting to look at as the space where we're more likely to find animals and animal presence and traces between the structures in the back alleys and the vacant lots and so on.
In Ella Simon's book, Through My Eyes, she speaks about how Aboriginal people used to know who was in their territory from the sounds of birds. The birds also would teach them what to eat and what not to eat by what they ate. So the birds were very, very much part of the Aboriginal life. I mean, they took their education from them. And even the calls of birds, they're sort of calling to one another. And they have to answer that call in order to meet up. So it's quite interesting sort of thing.
On that note, we
Okay.
have to actually finish because this room's about to be used. They'll be banging down the doors any moment now. But please join me in thanking. Thank you, Nat, for introducing Effie's upcoming paper for the library. But this is our very last paper in the History at Newcastle seminar series. No, really this time, 2025. But our regular host, Ryan Strickler, another one of our excellent colleagues, he's already hard at work on a fantastic lineup for 2026, and we hope to see you there.